Everybody knows 50 Cent as the rapper who turned 9 bullets into a billion-dollar brand. We know the headlines: drug dealer, shot 9 times, raised in South Jamaica, Queens, a mother lost too young, a childhood shaped by the crack era. The story sounds familiar, almost predictable. Hustle, violence, survival. But what if that story didn't start in Southside? What if it started in the South? What if long before the mixtapes, before the indictments, before the name 50 Cent, there were courtrooms, forced labor sentences, segregated military units, and a family navigating system designed to police them, use them, and discard them? This isn't just a story of a rapper. It's a story of a bloodline shaped by crime, service, and survival, long before Curtis Jackson ever stepped into a studio. And once you see the records, you realize something uncomfortable. He didn't invent the hustle. He inherited the pressure. I am Dyron Castro-Torres, the genealogist, and this is Crime, Service, and Survival, the Bloodline of 50 Cent. January 22nd, 2003, the Post-Star of Glen Falls, New York. The headline reads, "The Next Big Thing." The article introduces the new world to a young rapper from South Jamaica, Queens, 50 Cent, born Curtis James Jackson III. By this point, the mythology was already forming. Shot 9 times, survived, backed by Eminem and Dr. Dre. A street figure stepping into the mainstream. The paper presents him as hip-hop's rising force, hardened, disciplined, inevitable. But the article only hints at a deeper story. Curtis grew up in Queens in the 1980s, raised without a father. His mother, Sabrina Jackson, was involved in the drug trade, a reality of the era's underground economy. Curtis followed in a similar path as a teenager, moving contraband into the same neighborhood that raised him. That life brought him violence, arrests, and eventually the near-fatal shooting that will come central to his public identity. When Sabrina died, possibly murdered in a fire, Curtis was just 8 years old. His world shifted permanently. He was raised not by his parents, but his grandparents, Curtis James Jackson Sr. and Beulah Mae Jenkins. They provided stability in a neighborhood defined by instability. While Curtis built a reputation in the streets and later in the studio, it was their household that shaped his foundation. And to understand the full story, not just the rapper, but the bloodline, we have to step back from Queens and look at the lives of those grandparents. Because long before the fame, the records tell a story of service, punishment, and survival that begins generations earlier. February 28th, 1953, Edgefield County, South Carolina. In this marriage register, 2 young names are entered into the record: Curtis James Jackson, age 21, and Beulah Mae Jenkins, age 18, both from Johnson. Just teenagers stepping into adulthood in the rural Jim Crow South. No headlines, no spotlight, just ink on a paper marking the beginning of a household. This is the legal moment that binds the grandparents who would one day raise Curtis James Jackson III. They were young, barely out of childhood themselves, building a life in a country shaped by segregation, agricultural labor, and limited opportunity. This marriage record is quiet, but is foundational. It ties together 2 family lines already marked by service, punishment, and endurance. And to understand the stability they later provided for their grandson, we have to look closely at the man listed on this page, Curtis James Jackson Sr. 1940, Edgefield County, South Carolina. On the census page, we found a young boy at 7 years old, Curtis Jackson. Just like his grandson and namesake, 50 Cent, he is not in the household of his mother and father, but living with his maternal grandparents, Tom and Angeline Bush. Tom is listed as a farmer. Angeline keeps the home. Rural South Carolina, segregated America. A child being raised one generation up. Already, the pattern begins to form, grandparents anchoring the family structure. What's striking here is what we don't see. There's no clear record in this household identifying Curtis Sr.'s parents. No father listed beside him, no mother present in the home. To uncover that layer, we would have to move 2 generations further back, beyond Curtis Sr., beyond this household, and into the lives of Tom and Angelina Bush themselves. Because if we want to understand how this family survived, we have to start with the farmers who were raising the children when others could not. 1920, Shaw Township, Edgefield County, South Carolina. On this page, Thomas Bush is listed as the head of household, a farmer still working the land in the same country where generations before him had labored. Beside him is his wife, Angelina. In their home are their daughters, Mamie, Maria, and Lucilla. One of these young women would become the mother of Curtis Jackson Sr., though the records do not tell us which one. The answer lies between these 3 names, in this quiet, rural household. The census also tells us something deeper. Both Thomas and Angelina's parents were born in South Carolina. That means this family line stretches back to the same soil, likely into the late 19th century, possibly even into the Reconstruction-era and beyond. This is not a migrant family. This is a rooted South Carolina ancestry. And to understand how long the root system runs, now we have to turn to the death record of Thomas Bush. September 4th, 1965, Edgefield County, South Carolina. This death certificate closes the life of Thomas Bush at the age of 92, a widowed farmer, the son of Peter Bush and Lucille Hartley. Nearly a century of life spent in the same county where he was born. The informant on this record is his daughter, Lucille Walker. That detail matters because Lucille is now using the surname Walker, not Jackson, so we can rule her out as the mother of Curtis Jackson Sr. The paper trail narrows. The answer lies elsewhere among Thomas and Angelina's daughters. Thomas outlived his wife. The record lists him as widowed, meaning Angeline had already passed before 1965. To understand the full story of this household, the woman who stood beside him in 1920, who helped raise the next generation, we would now turn to the life and death of Angeline. November 16th, 1952, Edgefield County, South Carolina. This death certificate records the passing of Angelina Hamilton Bush, wife of Thomas Bush. She was born in Edgefield County, the daughter of Randall Hamilton, and notably, no mother is listed on the record. That omission is significant. In many South Carolina death certificates in this era, mothers' names were either unknown, forgotten, or simply never recorded. The informant on this document is her husband, Thomas Bush, the same farmer we saw in the census decades earlier. He is the one providing the information at the end of her life. Angelina's record narrows the lineage further. We now have a father's name, Randall Hamilton, but a missing maternal identity, another silence in the archive. And if we want to understand the roots of this South Carolina family, before the Jackson name, before the Bush household, we now have to move 1 generation deeper to Randall Hamilton. 1880, Edgefield County, South Carolina. On this page, Randall Hamilton appears as the head of household, working as a laborer. Beside him is his wife Lydia, and in their home is their 5-year-old daughter, Angelina, the same Angelina who would later marry Thomas Bush. This record also tells us that both Randall and Lydia's parents were born in South Carolina. That detail anchors the family line firmly in the state, pushing their roots back to the mid-19th century, into Reconstruction, and to the days before slavery was abolished. This household is modest, rural, and steady. A laborer, a wife, a young daughter. But one question still lingers. Who was Randall's mother? The 1880 census does not tell her name. To answer that, we need to step back another decade to 1870, the first federal census taken after emancipation, where formerly enslaved families appear by name for the first time. 1870, Edgefield County, South Carolina. This is the first federal census taken after emancipation. At the top is the household of Maria Hamilton, age 50, born in South Carolina around 1520. Beneath her is Randall Hamilton, age 22. The census does not list relationships to the head of household in 1870, but the age pattern strongly suggests Randall is her son. Both are listed as farm laborers, working the same land in the years immediately following the Civil War. This document places the Hamilton line squarely in the Reconstruction South, a generation removed from slavery. Maria was born around 1820, would have lived the majority of her life when slavery was legal. In 1870, she stood as the head of household, named in the federal record, and from her comes Randall. From Randall comes Angeline, and from that line eventually comes the Bush household that would help raise young Curtis Jackson Sr. Now, we move forward again, back to Beulah May Jenkins, 50 Cent's maternal grandmother, to see how the 19th century South Carolina lineage connects to Queens, New York. 1940, Edgefield County, South Carolina. On this census page, we find the 5-year-old girl listed as Beulah Jenkins, later known as Beulah May Jenkins, the future grandmother of Curtis James Jackson III. She is living in the household of her parents, Will Jenkins, age 30, and Louise Jenkins, age 27. Will is recorded as a laborer working on public roads, hard, physical work during the late Depression era, part of the infrastructure labor that kept rural counties functioning. This household is modest but intact, a young family in Johnson, South Carolina, with a father employed in public road labor and children growing up under Jim Crow. This is the environment that shaped Beulah before she would marry Curtis James Jackson Sr. and eventually help raise her grandson in Queens. And to understand the stability and the contradictions of this line, we now turn to the life and service of Will Jenkins. June 5th, 1917, Johnson, Edgefield County, South Carolina. This is the World War I draft registration card of Willie Jenkins, born March 16, 1896, in Edgefield. At 21 years old, he is working as a porter at a drugstore, steady employment in a segregated southern town. The card described him physically: medium built, brown eyes, black hair. A young black man registering for a war in a country that did not yet grant him full rights. Now look at the bottom of the card. You see his name written, but in the center of that signature is an X. That X is his mark, and it means he could not write his name. Someone else likely wrote it for him, and he placed his mark in the middle to affirm it. That small detail speaks volumes about the education access in Jim Crow, South Carolina. And then look over to the lower left corner of the card, what appears to be a harmless clipped edge of the document. On its own, it looks incidental, but when compared to other draft cards, the corner begins to mean something more. So now, let's look at another World War I draft card from an unrelated man and compare it. Now, look at this World War I draft card from an unrelated man with no connection to this family. His card is intact. Focus on the lower left-hand corner. When we zoom in, we can clearly read the printed instruction. If the person is of African descent, tear off this corner. On this card, the corner remains untouched. That small printed instruction tells us something chilling. During World War I registration, draft boards were instructed to physically mark the cards of black men by removing the corner. It was a bureaucratic system of racial identification embedded directly into federal paperwork. On Willie Jenkins' card, that corner is gone. It wasn't accidental damage. It was deliberate. The state marked him before he ever put on a uniform. But here's the critical question. Just because Willie Jenkins registered for the draft does not mean that he actually served. Registration was mandatory. Service was not. So now we return to Willie Jenkins and we ask the next question the record demands. Did he go to war or did he stay in South Carolina? This headstone application settles the question. Will Jenkins did not just register, he served. This record shows he enlisted on April 29, 1918 and was discharged on July 17, 1919. He was a private in the United States Army assigned to Company D, 321st Service Battalion. These service battalions were segregated units made up of largely of black soldiers. They were not frontline combat regiments. They were the logistical backbone of the American Expeditionary Forces, loading supplies, building roads, maintaining transport lines, and performing the essential labor that kept the Army functioning overseas. It was dangerous, grueling work, often under harsh conditions and rarely celebrated. The document also confirms that he was born on March 16, 1896 in South Carolina, and that he died on April 10, 1970, more than 50 years after the war. His son applied for the government headstone to mark his grave in Edgefield County. The same federal government that once clipped the corner of his draft card is now formally recognizing his service. That arc from a marked draft card to a military headstone tells us a powerful story about contradiction, duty, and dignity. But if we want to go further back, beyond his service, beyond World War I, we have to ask another question. Who were Will Jenkins' parents? To answer that, we turn to the 1900 United States Census, where we look for young Willie Jenkins in Edgefield County and trace his family one generation deeper. 1900, Edgefield County, South Carolina. On this census page, we find a 3-year-old boy listed as Wilson Jenkins, the same child who would later appear as Willie Jenkins on the draft card and Will Jenkins on his military headstone. He is the son of Peter Jenkins, born in 1855, working as a day laborer, and Savannah Jenkins, born in 1860, employed as a washwoman. This is a working-class black household in the post-Reconstruction South. Manual labor, domestic work, and survival built on daily wages. Peter and Savannah were both born in South Carolina, placing their births squarely in the years just before and just after the Civil War. That means Will's parents were either born enslaved or into the immediate aftermath after emancipation. From Peter and Savannah comes Wilson, later Willie, the porter, the soldier, the father, and from him will become Beulah May Jenkins. But before we move forward, we need to look at the woman who stood beside him, Louise, Will's wife and the mother of Beulah May Jenkins. August 16, 1964, Aiken County, South Carolina. This death certificate records Louise, here listed under the surname Barney, a detail that raises a question that I do not have the answer to. Despite the different last name, the record clearly identifies her as the wife of Will Jenkins. More importantly, it names her parents, Jim Daniels and Beulah Zimmerman. That one line connects Beulah May Jenkins' mother directly back to another generation in Edgefield County. That surname shift to Barney may reflect a prior marriage, a clerical error, or a name used at some point in her life, but the parental identification anchors her identity. Louise, wife of Will Jenkins and mother of Beulah May Jenkins, is now tied to Jim Daniels and Beulah Zimmerman. So now, we step back to look for Jim Daniels and Beulah Zimmerman to see the household that raised Louise. February 7th, 1919, Edgefield County, South Carolina. In this marriage register, Jim Daniels, age 21, and Beulah Zimmerman, age 20, both of Johnson, step into the record as husband and wife. Young, just out of their teens, their marriage takes place only months after World War I ends, in a South still defined by segregation, agricultural labor, and limited economic opportunity. This is the union that would eventually produce Louise, and through her, Beulah May Jenkins. They were building a household in the same town where generations before them had worked as laborers and farmers. But what kind of life were they building? What pressures shaped their decisions? To understand that, we need to look more closely at Beulah Zimmerman herself and ask whether, in her own time and in her own way, she too was navigating the same survival economy that later generations would call hustle, trying to get rich, or at least survive, in a system designed to keep her neither. July 21st, 1915, the Columbia Record, Columbia, South Carolina. This newspaper article reports on a blind tiger raid in Johnson that resulted in heavy fines and forced labor sentences, including one for Beulah Zimmerman. In simple terms, the town of Johnson carried out a major raid on what was known as a blind tiger, an illegal liquor operation. This was during Prohibition-era in South Carolina, when selling alcohol without a license was against the law. Local authorities arrested 13 people, and the case drew a lot of public attention, even taking 2 days to try because of the heat the crowd had gathered. Most of those arrested were convicted and fined. Some, including Beulah Zimmerman, were ordered to pay money, and when the fines could not be paid, they were sentenced to hard labor. In this case, working on the streets or in the county chain gang. In short, this was a crackdown of illegal alcohol sales, and Beulah's name appears among those caught up in the sweep. And this is where the generational pattern becomes striking. Decades later, 50 Cent's mother, Sabrina Jackson, will be involved in the underground drug trade in New York during the crack era. 50 Cent himself would grow up in the same environment and later speak openly about his own involvement in the street economy before music changed his trajectory. Different centuries, different substances, but the same theme: participation in illicit economies operating in the shadows of American law. Not as glamour, but as survival within systems that often left few legal paths for advancement. So now the question becomes, where did Beulah Zimmerman come from? Let's go back another generation and see if we can identify her parents and the household that shaped her before that 1915 raid. Here, in the 1900 and 1910 censuses of Edgefield County, we can trace Beulah Zimmerman as a child and then as a teenager. In 1900, she appeared as a 3-year-old in the household of her mother, Beulah Zimmerman, who is listed as about 29 years old and widowed. That detail is critical: widowed. It tells us that Beulah's father had already died before 1900. Fast forward to 1910, we find Beulah, now at about 16 years old, living in the home of Ben Zimmerman, identified as her uncle. When you line those two records up side by side, a picture sharpens. If Beulah is living with her widowed mother in 1900 and then with Ben Zimmerman in 1910, and Ben is identified as her uncle, the most logical conclusion is that Ben Zimmerman is the brother of Chauvy's deceased husband, Beulah's father. That means the Zimmerman line we're tracing here is her paternal line. So now that the next step is clear, let's go further back and see if we can identify Ben Zimmerman's parents, because in doing so, we'll uncover the paternal grandparents of Beulah Zimmerman. Here, in the 1880 census of Edgefield County, South Carolina, we find the Zimmerman household, anchored by Mike Zimmerman, 45 years old, a farmer, and his wife Margaret, 41. Living under their roof are their sons, Charles, Griffin, Isaiah, and at the bottom, a younger Benjamin Zimmerman. This is the generation just before Beulah, a family structure that shaped the Zimmerman name in Edgefield in the late 19th century. Since we later identified Ben Zimmerman as Beulah's uncle, that means one of his brothers, Charles, Griffin, or Isaiah, is likely Beulah's father. The census doesn't let us know which one, and without a surviving death record or marriage record naming him directly, this is where the documentary trail goes cold. And sometimes, in genealogy, this is where the paper stops, leaving us with strong evidence, a narrow field of possibilities, and the understanding that not every story survives the ink. Crime, service, survival. That's not just a catchy title. That's the arc of this bloodline. We trace 50 Cent's maternal line from the streets of Queens back to the red clay of Edgefield County, South Carolina. Along the way, we found illegal liquor raids, chain gang sentences, widowed mothers holding households together, laborers working public roads, and a World War I private that served this country in a segregated army service battalion. These were not abstract names on a chart. They were people navigating systems stacked against them. We saw Beulah Zimmerman caught in a 1915 blind tiger raid during Prohibition enforced in South Carolina. We saw Will Jenkins register for the draft, unable to sign his name, marking it with an X, and yet ultimately serving from April 29, 1918 to July 17, 1919 in Company D, 321st Service Battalion. We saw widows, farm laborers, washwomen, day laborers, men and women operating within limited opportunity structures, doing what they had to do to survive. And then, generations later, we see the echoes. Sabrina Jackson navigating the underground economy in 1980s New York. 50 Cent himself stepping into the same world before transforming his trajectory through music and business. Different eras, different substances, same structural pressures, same survival instinct. The underworld wasn't glamour, it was adaptation. But here's what matters the most. This lineage was not defined by crime. It was defined by resilience. It is defined by service. It is defined by the ability to endure. Through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, Prohibition, World War I, the Great Migration era, and the crack epidemic, and still produce a global icon who rewrote his story. When you understand the genealogy, you understand that success didn't start in a recording studio. It started in the fields, on roads, in courtrooms, in barracks, and in households that refused to collapse. This is what genealogy does. It reframes the narrative. It replaces stereotypes with documentation. It shows that behind every headline is a bloodline. And when you follow that bloodline far enough back, you find something deeper than scandal or fame. You find survival. I am Dyron Castro Torres, the genealogist, and this is just the beginning.